The storm wasn't angry. It was patient. That was the first thing you noticed about winter in the deep Rockies. It didn't rush. It simply began with a single flake, drifting lazily past the windshield of the old Ford truck, followed by another and then another, until the world turned into a soft white blur. The road ahead, a winding ribbon of asphalt, climbing 5,000 feet into the clouds, was disappearing. Most people would have turned back. If you enjoy this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more content. Before we drive through those gates and settle in for the long winter, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Adjust your pillow, pull the blanket up to your chin, and let your body sink into the mattress. We are going to a place where emails, alarms, and traffic do not exist. If you find peace in these stories and want to return to this sanctuary of sleep, please press that subscribe button. It helps us keep the fire lit and the stories coming. Now, take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and let the snow fall. The Winter Watch at Timberline. The tires of the truck crunched over the packed snow, a rhythmic, satisfying sound that vibrated gently through the steering wheel. Elias gripped the wheel with gloved hands, the leather worn smooth by years of use. He wasn't rushing. In a place like this, rushing was the first mistake. You had to move at the pace of the mountain, and the mountain was slow. The Timberline Lodge sat at the edge of a frozen alpine lake, nestled in a bowl of granite peaks that scratched the belly of the gray sky. It was a structure built in the era of giants, huge ponderosa logs stacked one atop another, chinked with mortar that had held strong against a century of blizzards. The roof was steep and green, designed to shed the heavy snows of February, and a massive stone chimney anchored the structure to the earth like a root. Elias pulled the truck up to the main entrance. The engine rattled and then fell silent as he turned the key. For a moment, he didn't move. He just sat there, listening. The silence was immense. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a physical weight. It pressed against the glass, heavy and soft. There was no hum of electricity, no distant drone of airplanes, no bird calls, just the whisper of wind moving through the tops of the spruce trees, sounding like the ocean far away. He opened the door and stepped out. The air was crisp, tasting of ice and pine needles. It filled his lungs, waking up every cell in his body before settling into a cold calm. He walked to the back of the truck, grabbing his duffel bag and a crate of supplies, coffee, canned goods, a few books, and a heavy wool blanket. The front door of the lodge was formidable, solid oak, bound with iron straps. Elias fished the brass key from his pocket. It was cold metal, heavy in his palm. He slid it into the lock. The mechanism was well oiled. It turned with a heavy funk that echoed in the quiet clearing. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside was still, smelling of cedar, old leather, and wood smoke from fires long extinguished. It was colder inside than out, a preserved chill that had settled in the bones of the building. Elias dropped his bags on the slate floor of the foyer and exhaled, his breath pluming in the dim light filtering through the high windows. "Hello, old girl," he whispered. The lodge seemed to absorb his voice, accepting his presence. He wasn't a guest here. He was the keeper. For the next 4 months, until the thaw of spring broke the ice on the lake, He was the only living soul for 20 miles. His first order of business was heat. He walked into the great room. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the frozen lake. In the center of the room stood the fireplace, a massive mouth of river stone capable of holding logs the size of a man. Elias knelt before the hearth. He liked the ritual of fire-making. It was primal and precise. He crumbled up old newspaper, dated from last October, and arranged a teepee of kindling, dry cedar splinters that smelled sharp and sweet. He struck a match. The sulfur flared, a brief yellow sun in the gloom, and he touched it to the paper. The flame caught. It licked up the newsprint, curling. He moved to the kitchen next. It was a large, utilitarian space with a cast-iron stove and copper pots hanging from a rack above the center island. He located the main water valve in the pantry and turned it. The pipes groaned and shuddered, a mechanical clearing of the throat before water rushed through the system. He went to the sink and turned the tap. After a few sputters of air, clear, icy mountain water flowed. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove. While he waited for the whistle, he unpacked his crate. A bag of dark roast coffee beans went into the glass jar on the counter. A loaf of sourdough bread wrapped in paper. A block of sharp cheddar cheese. A jar of strawberry preserves. Simple things. Up here, food tasted better. Hunger was sharper, and satisfaction was deeper. The kettle whistled. Elias made a pot of tea, Earl Grey, the bergamot steam rising in the cold kitchen air. He wrapped his hands around the ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into his palms, and walked back to the great room. He sat in the leather armchair facing the window. The leather groaned softly as he settled in. Outside, the snow was falling harder now. The peaks across the lake were gone, erased by the white curtain. The lake itself was a flat white expanse, indistinguishable from the shore. He watched the snow fall. There was a hypnotic quality to it. Each flake was unique, yet together they formed a uniform blanket that softened the jagged edges of the world. It covered the rocks, the stumps, the fallen branches. It smoothed everything out, turning the landscape into a clean slate. Elias took a sip of tea. It was hot and floral. He felt his shoulders drop an inch. The tension of the drive, of the city he had left behind, of the responsibilities that usually crowded his mind, they were all fading. Here, his responsibilities were simple. Keep the fire lit. Keep the pipes from freezing. Keep the snow cleared from the walkways. Survival, maintenance, solitude. As evening approached, the light in the room shifted from the gray of the storm to the warm gold of the fire. He didn't turn on the electric lamps. He preferred the firelight. It felt more natural, more in tune with the rhythm of the place. He decided to inspect the library before bed. It was a small room off the main hall, lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling. The books were old, leather-bound classics, field guides to local flora and fauna, and a collection of journals from previous caretakers. He ran a finger along the spines. He pulled out a journal dated 1948. The cover was worn canvas, stained with coffee rings. He opened it to a random page. December 12th, 1948, the entry read in neat cursive handwriting. Heavy snow today, 3 feet in the last 24 hours. The elk came down from the ridge this morning. I saw a herd of 20 moving across the lake ice, silent as ghosts. The silence here is a teacher. It teaches you to listen to yourself. I shoveled the walk 3 times, but the wind fills it back in. I think I will let the wind win tonight. The stew is hot, the fire is good. I am content. He smiled. He felt a kinship with this stranger from the past. They were sharing the same space, the same weather, the same solitude, separated only by time. He closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. He would read it properly later, perhaps tomorrow night when the storm was truly howling. He returned to the great room. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing red coals. He added a massive log, a night log, meant to burn slow and long. He placed a wire screen in front of the hearth to catch any popping sparks. He walked to the window one last time. It was pitch black now. He could see nothing but his own reflection in the glass, and behind him, the warm, inviting room. But he knew the snow was still falling. He could feel it. He climbed the stairs to the loft where the caretaker's quarters were. The bed was a simple wooden frame with a thick down comforter and a quilt made of heavy wool patches. He changed into thermal pajamas and climbed in. The sheets were cold at first, crisp against his skin, but his body heat soon created a warm cocoon. He lay on his back, staring up at the exposed wooden beams of the ceiling. The wind had picked up. He could hear it whistling softly around the eaves of the roof, a low, mournful song. But inside he was safe. The walls were thick, the roof was strong. The fire was burning downstairs. He closed his eyes. He listened to the wind. He visualized the snow piling up outside, inch by inch, sealing him in. The road was gone now. The gate was buried. He was an island in a sea of white. And for the first time in years, Elias fell asleep not because he was exhausted, but because he was at peace. The next morning, Elias woke to a light so bright it pierced through his eyelids. He opened his eyes and blinked. The room was filled with a brilliant white radiance. He sat up and looked out the window. The storm had broken. The sky was a piercing, impossible blue without a single cloud, and the world below was diamond dust. As he reached the door, he stopped. There were tracks in the snow that weren't his. They were small, delicate prints, shaped like little hands. A raccoon? No, too big for a mouse, too small for a fox. He followed them with his eyes. They led from the edge of the forest, across the clearing, and disappeared under the crawl space of the porch. Elias smiled. He wasn't alone after all. He had a tenant. He brought the wood inside, stacking it neatly by the hearth. The physical exertion had warmed him up. He stripped off his parka and sat by the fire with his coffee. He decided to spend the day exploring the lodge itself. It was a massive building, full of nooks and crannies he hadn't seen in years. He walked down the east wing hallway, the floorboards creaking comfortably under his boots. The walls were hung with black and white photographs from the 1920s. Men in flat caps standing next to Model T Fords stuck in the mud. Women in long skirts holding stringers of trout. The history of the place was written on the walls. He found a door at the end of the hall that was slightly ajar. It led to the sunroom. The sunroom was freezing. The windows were single-pane glass, but it was breathtaking. It jutted out over the lake, offering a 180-degree view of the valley. In the corner sat an old upright piano, covered in a dust sheet. Elias walked over and pulled the sheet off. A cloud of dust motes danced in the sunbeams. The wood of the piano was a rich mahogany, glowing in the light. He sat on the bench and pressed a key. Middle C. Ping. The note was slightly out of tune, wavering in the cold air, but it was resonant. He played a chord, C major. It sounded bright and hopeful against the backdrop of the silent snow. He wasn't a pianist, not really. He knew a few hymns, a few folk songs. He played Amazing Grace, the notes slow and simple. The music seemed to fill the house, chasing away the last of the shadows. When he finished, he sat in the silence, watching a hawk circle high above the frozen lake. The hawk was just a speck, a master of the air currents, looking for movement in the stillness below. The afternoon passed in a blur of quiet activity. Elias fixed a loose hinge on the pantry door. He polished the brass knocker on the front door. He organized the canned goods by date. Simple tasks, tangible results. As the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snow, the temperature began to drop rapidly. The blue sky turned to a bruised violet, then a deep indigo. Elias retreated to the great room. He built the fire up again, making it a fortress against the coming night. He made dinner, a simple vegetable stew with the sourdough bread. He ate slowly, savoring the flavors, listening to the house settle as the temperature fell. The wooden beams contracted with loud cracks that sounded like gunshots in the quiet, but Elias knew it was just the house breathing. After dinner, he returned to the library. He wanted to find out more about the history of the lodge. He pulled down a heavy letter album titled Construction and Early Years, 1918 to 1925. He settled into the chair with his tea. The pages were thick cardstock, holding sepia-toned photographs mounted with little black corners. He saw pictures of the foundation being laid, men with horses dragging massive stones from the riverbed. He saw the skeleton of the lodge rising against the sky, a lattice of raw timber. And then he turned a page and saw something that made him pause. It was a photograph of the crew standing in front of the finished fireplace. In the center stood a man who looked remarkably like Elias. Same jawline, same heavy brow. The caption underneath read, Foreman Silas Torn, Winter 1924. Elias stared at the photo. Torn was his last name, but his father had never mentioned a Silas. His family was from the coast, fishermen and boat builders. What was a Torn doing up here in the mountains, building a lodge? He leaned closer to the photo. Torn was holding something in his hand. It looked like a pocket watch, but the chain was hanging loose, as if it was broken. Elias felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck. It wasn't fear, but curiosity mixed with a sense of destiny. He had felt drawn to this job, drawn to this isolation. Part 2. The Echo of the Mountain. The days at Timberline didn't follow a clock. There was no urgent ticking of a second hand, no digital alarms slicing through the morning quiet. Instead, time was measured in the changing angle of the sunlight on the floorboards, the slow accumulation of snow on the window ledge, and the rhythm of the fire that needed feeding. Elias woke on his third day to a world wrapped in gray wool. The brilliant blue sky of the previous day had retreated behind a thick, low-hanging cloud bank that snagged the tops of the spruce trees. It was a cozy, dim morning, the kind that made leaving the warmth of the quilt feel like a minor tragedy. He stretched, hearing the satisfying pop of his joints, and swung his legs out of bed. The floor was cold, a reminder that the fire downstairs had burned low. He pulled on his wool socks, thick, gray rag wool with a red stripe at the top, and shuffled downstairs. The lodge was silent, save for the wind humming a low baritone note in the chimney. He tended to the hearth first. He stirred the ashes, finding a few glowing embers buried deep like sleeping dragons. He fed them birch bark and blew gently until the orange flame licked upward, hungry and bright. Within minutes, the heat began to radiate outward, pushing the chill back toward the walls. Breakfast was oatmeal, cooked slowly on the cast-iron stove with milk, brown sugar, and a dash of cinnamon. He ate standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the gray expanse of the lake. It was snowing again, but gently this time. Large, fluffy flakes that drifted down vertically, landing with no sound. With his hunger satisfied and a fresh mug of coffee in hand, Elias felt the pull of the mystery he had uncovered the night before. Silas Thorne. The name had rolled around in his mind as he slept. He decided to look for the workshop. If Silas had been the foreman, he would have had a space of his own, a place for tools, plans, and quiet work. The lodge had a basement, accessible through a narrow door under the main staircase. Elias found the key on the master ring, a small iron skeleton key that looked older than the others. He unlocked the door. It opened with a groan of dry hinges. The air that drifted up from the dark was cool and smelled of earth, sawdust, and old grease. Elias clicked on his heavy flashlight and descended the wooden steps. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a cavernous space that ran the length of the house. It was supported by massive stone pillars, the foundation of the mountain lodge. To the left, there were rows of shelves filled with paint cans and spare tiles. To the right, the boiler hummed softly, a metal heart pumping hot water through the veins of the building. But in the back corner, partitioned off by a wall of rough-hewn planks, was a room. Elias walked toward it, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The door to this room was unlocked. He pushed it open. He shone the light around and gasped softly. It was a time capsule. It was a carpenter's workshop, untouched for what looked like decades. A sturdy workbench made of thick maple sat in the center, its surface scarred by chisels and saws. Tools hung on the wall in organized rows: hand planes, augers, levels, and hammers, all resting in outlines drawn in pencil. Elias ran his hand along the workbench. The dust was thick, a gray velvet coating, but beneath it, the wood was solid. He felt a connection here, a tactile link to the man in the photograph. He could imagine Silas standing here, surrounded by the smell of shaving wood, planning the beams that now held the roof up over Elias's head. On the corner of the bench sat a wooden chest. It was small, perhaps the size of a shoebox, made of cherry wood with dovetail joints that spoke of a master craftsman. Carved into the lid were the initials S.T. Elias set his flashlight on the bench, illuminating the box in a pool of stark white light. He wiped the dust from the lid. There was no lock. He lifted it. Inside, resting on a bed of dried moss, were 3 items. First, a compass, heavy brass, with a glass face that was slightly cracked. The needle still floated freely, swinging north to point toward the back of the basement. Second, a pipe. The bowl was carved from briarwood, darkened by years of use. It still smelled faintly of sweet tobacco, a scent that seemed to defy the passage of time. And third, a small—
Elias picked up the notebook. It was smaller than the ledger he'd seen in the library. This was a pocketbook, meant to be carried in a coat while climbing scaffolding or walking the perimeter. He didn't open it yet. The basement felt too cold, too dark for such an intimate discovery. He wanted to be upstairs, by the fire, with the gray light of the snow day coming through the windows. He took the box and headed back up the stairs, locking the basement door behind him. The afternoon settled into a deep, comfortable lull. The snow continued to fall, adding another inch to the blanket outside. Elias spent an hour in the great room, just watching the weather. There was something hypnotic about the way the trees held the snow, their branches bowing lower and lower until, whoomph, they would dump their load and spring back up, only to begin the cycle again. He decided to brave the outdoors for a bit. The air in the lodge was getting stale, and he needed to clear the intake vent for the furnace, which was located on the side of the house. He suited up, parka, scarf, gloves, and a beanie pulled low over his ears. Opening the front door was like opening the airlock of a spaceship. The silence of the outdoors rushed in to meet him. He stepped off the porch, sinking to his knees. He laughed, the sound swallowed instantly by the snow. He waded through the drifts, the cold biting his cheeks pleasantly. He cleared the vent, using his gloved hands to scoop away the white powder. The furnace chugged gratefully, the exhaust steam pluming white against the white wall. As he turned to go back inside, a flash of movement at the edge of the woods caught his eye. He froze. There, standing by the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, was a red fox. Its coat was vibrant, a shock of burning orange against the monochromatic world. Its black socks looked like it was wearing boots. It watched Elias with golden, intelligent eyes, its head cocked slightly to the side. "Hello," Elias whispered. The fox didn't run. It seemed curious. In the deep winter, animals sometimes lost their fear, driven by a mix of hunger and the strange truce that extreme weather imposes on the wild. Elias moved slowly, reaching into his pocket. He had a handful of unsalted peanuts he had grabbed for a snack. He tossed one gently toward the tree. It landed with a soft plip in the snow about 10 feet from the fox. The fox tensed, ears swiveling. Then, with a fluid, graceful motion, it trotted forward. It sniffed the nut, crunched it quickly, and looked back at Elias. "That's all I've got on me," Elias said softly. "Come back later." The fox held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and vanished into the underbrush as if it had been a spirit. Elias smiled, his face numb but his heart warm. He tromped back to the porch, kicking the snow off his boots before stepping back into the sanctuary of the lodge. That evening, the storm intensified. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the building, rattling the window panes in their frames. It was the kind of night that made you grateful for 4 walls and a roof. Elias made a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup. He ate in front of the fire, dipping the crispy, buttery bread into the hot red soup. It was comfort food in its purest form. After dinner, he cleared the table and poured a glass of amber whiskey. He took the wooden box he had found in the basement and settled into the wingback chair. He picked up the small leather notebook. The binding creaked as he opened it. The handwriting was different from the ledger. It was looser, less formal. It was written in pencil. October 14th, 1924, the first entry read. "The roof is on. We beat the first snow by a day. The men are celebrating in town, but I stayed behind. I prefer the quiet. There is a specific frequency to this mountain. If you listen, you can hear the granite humming." Elias took a sip of whiskey. He knew exactly what Silas meant. He had felt it himself, that deep, resonant stillness. He flipped a few pages. November 20th, 1924. The finish work begins. I am carving the mantelpiece myself. I want it to look like the river, flowing, constant. I hid a coin in the mortar behind the center stone, a silver dollar for luck. May it bring prosperity to whomever sits before this fire. Elias looked up at the massive stone fireplace. He scanned the center stones. They were rough, river-washed granite. Somewhere in there, 100 years ago, a man had placed a wish. He read on. December 24th, 1924. Christmas Eve. I am alone at the lodge. The road is impassable. I don't mind. I walked out to the frozen lake tonight. The stars were so bright.
"I'm here, Silas," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm listening." The wind outside seemed to drop for a moment, as if the mountain was acknowledging him. Elias stayed up late that night, simply sitting with the legacy of the house. He felt less alone than he ever had
in the crowded streets of Seattle. He had the fox in the woods, the spirit of his great-grandfather in the walls, and the endless, comforting weight of the winter snow. When he finally climbed the stairs to bed, the floorboards didn't just creak, they seemed to sing a low note of welcome. He crawled under the heavy quilt, the heat of the day fading into a comfortable cool. He closed his eyes and visualized the map of the mountain in his mind. He saw the lodge as a tiny, warm spark in a vast, dark wilderness. He breathed in pine and old paper. He breathed out peace. Sleep came quickly, a deep, dreamless drift into the darkness, carried on the back of the wind. Part 3. The Hidden Cabin. The next morning brought a surprise. Elias woke not to the gray of a storm, nor the blinding white of the sun, but to a strange, muffled stillness. He looked out the window. The snow had stopped, but a thick fog had rolled in. It was a dense, white mist that clung to the ground, erasing the horizon. The lake was gone. The trees were gone. The world ended 10 feet from the porch railing. It felt like the lodge was floating in a cloud. Elias went through his morning ritual, fire, coffee, oatmeal, with a slow, deliberate pleasure. The discovery of the journal had grounded him. He felt a sense of ownership now. He wasn't just passing through. After breakfast, he decided to examine the map he had seen in the library hall. It was a framed topographical map of the region, dated 1950. He studied the contour lines, the jagged peaks represented by concentric circles. The lodge was marked with a small black square. He traced the line of the old logging road that led up from the valley. But then he noticed something faint, a pencil mark. Someone, likely Silas, or perhaps a later caretaker who knew the secret, had drawn a faint line leading away from the lodge, heading north along the ridge line, deeper into the woods. The line ended at a small X near a cluster of rocks known as the Chimneys. Curiosity pricked at him. The Chimneys were only 2 miles from the lodge. In summer, it would be an easy walk. In 3 feet of snow, it was an expedition. He checked the barometer on the wall. The pressure was steady. The fog wasn't going to lift, but no storm was imminent. He decided to go. He packed a day pack, a thermos of hot soup, a bag of trail mix, a first aid kit, and the compass from Silas's box. He strapped on a pair of snowshoes that hung in the mudroom, old-fashioned wooden frames with rawhide lacing. He stepped out into the fog. Walking on snowshoes was a unique sensation. It was a wide-legged, rolling gait. The wooden frames distributed his weight, keeping him on top of the deep powder. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The fog distorted sound. His breath sounded loud in his ears. The trees loomed out of the mist like giants, dark and wet, their needles dripping onto the snow. He checked the compass. The needle swung true. He headed north. The hike was strenuous but meditative. The cold air was invigorating. He fell into a rhythm, his mind clearing of all thoughts except the next step. He navigated by the trees, keeping the slope of the mountain on his right. After an hour, the terrain began to change. Huge boulders, capped with snow like marshmallows, began to appear. He was nearing the chimneys, a formation of vertical rock spires. He slowed down, scanning the gray mist. And then he saw it. Ensconced between two massive granite spires, almost invisible against the rock and snow, was a structure. It wasn't a house. It was a... The weather shifted 3 days later. It didn't creep in like the fog. It announced itself with a drop in pressure that Elias could feel in his ears. The barometer in the hallway, a brass instrument that looked like a ship's gauge, had tapped the glass all the way down to storm. The sky turned a bruised purple, heavy and low. The wind, which had been a gentle hum for days, began to moan in the chimney. It was a sound of deep, raw power, the voice of the Rockies clearing its throat. Elias knew what was coming, a true winter gale. He spent the morning preparing. It was a satisfying kind of work, the work of fortification. He went out to the woodshed 3 times, dragging the sled piled high with logs until the stack inside the great room reached halfway up the wall. He checked the latches on all the windows. He filled the bathtub with water just in case the pipes froze. He brought in the heavy storm shutters for the lower windows, bolting them into the thick pine frames. By noon, the lodge was sealed. It felt like a ship battened down for a hurricane. The first flakes began to fall around 1 o'clock. They weren't the soft, fluffy feathers of the previous week. These were hard pellets of ice, driven sideways by a 30-mile-an-hour wind. They hit the glass like sand being thrown against the window. Hiss, hiss, hiss. Elias stood in the center of the great room. The fire was roaring, a defiant beast of heat against the cold pressing on the walls. He felt a thrill of primal satisfaction. There is no feeling quite like being warm when the world outside is freezing. With the storm raging, there was no guilt in doing absolutely nothing. But Elias's mind was still active. He thought of the hidden cabin, buried now under drifting snow. He thought of the fox, hopefully curled up tight in a burrow beneath the roots of the firs. And he thought of the attic. It was the only part of the lodge he hadn't explored. The trap door was located in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway, accessible by a pull-down cord. He waited until evening, when the storm was at its peak, to go up. It seemed fitting. He pulled the cord. The ladder slid down with a smooth mechanical slide. A puff of cool, dry air descended, smelling of cedar shavings and old paper. Elias took a lantern, an electric camping lantern that cast a warm 360-degree glow, and climbed. The attic was vast. It ran the entire length of the lodge, sloping sharply with the pitch of the roof. The beams here were massive, rough-hewn timbers that met at the peak like the ribs of a whale. The sound of the storm was louder here, a constant drumming roar, but the roof held firm. There were no leaks, no drafts. Silas Torn had built for the ages. This space was mostly empty, save for the insulation packed between the floor joists. But at the far end, near the chimney stack, there was a defined space, a floor of polished planks, a rug and a desk. He walked toward it, his lantern swinging, casting long, dancing shadows against the rafters. It was a drafting station. The desk was angled, made of oak. On it lay a T-square, a compass, and a roll of paper weighed down by smooth river stones. Elias set the lantern down and carefully unrolled the paper. They were the blueprints of the lodge, but they were hand-drawn, inked with an incredible level of detail. Every joint, every mortise and tenon was sketched with love. He studied them, tracing the lines of the great room, the kitchen, the library. And then he noticed a detail in the drawing of the roof, the very roof he was standing under. In the center of the schematic, right above the desk where he stood, Silas had drawn a mechanism. It looked like a gear system connected to a panel in the roof. The label read, "The Oculus." He looked up. Directly above the desk, the ceiling was paneled with tongue-and-groove cedar. But looking closely, he saw the seam, a square section about 4 feet wide. Through the glass, the storm was a terrifying, chaotic masterpiece. He could see the snow flying past in horizontal streaks, illuminated by the faint light of the lantern reflecting off the clouds. It was like being inside a snow globe that was being shaken by a giant. He was inches away from the fury of the winter, yet completely safe. He looked back at the blueprints. There was a note scribbled in the margin. "The fire warms the body, but the stars warm the soul. Open only when the mind is clouded." Elias watched the storm for a long time. He watched the wind whip the snow into frenzies. He watched the darkness press against the glass. And then the power went out. The electric lantern flickered and died. The battery must have been low. Downstairs, the hum of the refrigerator stopped. The lodge went pitch black, save for the gray swirl of the storm above him. Elias didn't panic. He felt his way to the ladder and climbed down. The hallway was dark. He navigated by memory to the stairs and went down to the great room. The fire was the only light in the world. It cast long, flickering shadows that danced on the log walls. The room was a cave of orange warmth. Elias went to the kitchen, found the box of beeswax candles he had seen in the pantry, and lit 3 of them. He placed them on the mantel. The loss of electricity made the lodge feel even more isolated, even more authentic. This was how Silas had lived. No hum of appliances, no electric light, just fire and wax. He pulled the wingback chair closer to the hearth. He wrapped himself in the wool blanket. The wind battered the heavy door, but the iron straps held. The snow piled up against the windows, creating a natural insulation. Elias poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. He sat there for hours, staring into the flames. He thought about the oculus in the attic. When the storm cleared, when the sky was black and the stars were out, that room would be the most beautiful place on earth. But for now, the storm was the show. He fell asleep in the chair that night, the fire popping gently, the smell of beeswax and wood smoke filling his dreams. He dreamed he was a bear in a cave, sleeping through the long winter, waiting for the green of spring. Part 5. The Unexpected Guest. The storm raged for 2 days. Elias fell into a state of deep hibernation. He moved only to feed the fire, to eat, and to sleep. He read 3 books. He finished the entire journal of the 1948 caretaker. He learned the creaks of the floorboards so well he could walk through the dark lodge without making a sound. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind died. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias opened the front door. He had to shove hard. A drift had piled up against the bottom. When he finally broke the seal, he stepped out into a world that had been reset. The snow was 4 feet deep. The truck was a white mound. The path to the woodpile was gone. The trees were bent low under the weight. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, casting a pale, milky light over the landscape. Elias grabbed the shovel. It was time to dig out. He was sweating within 10 minutes. The work was hard, but the air was so fresh it felt like breathing pure oxygen. He carved a canyon through the snow toward the woodpile. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he heard a sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the settling of the house. It was an engine. Elias stopped, leaning on his shovel. An engine? Up here? The road was buried under 5 feet of drift. No plow had come through. The sound grew louder, a high-pitched whine. And then, bursting from the tree line, came a snowmobile. It was a sleek, modern machine, bright yellow. The rider was bundled in black gear. They saw Elias and gunned the engine, carving a wide arc through the powder before coming to a stop near the porch. The rider killed the engine. The silence rushed back in, ringing in Elias's ears. The rider took off their helmet. It was a woman. She had flushed cheeks and bright eyes, her hair matted slightly from the helmet. She looked to be in her 30s, wearing a ranger patch on her jacket. "You're alive," she called out, her breath pluming. Elias smiled, leaning on his shovel. "Last time I checked." She laughed, climbing off the sled and sinking to her knees in the snow. She waded over to the porch. "I'm Sarah, ranger for the district. We knew there was a new caretaker up here, and when the storm hit, well, this was a big one. Just wanted to do a welfare check, make sure you hadn't frozen to death or gone steer crazy.
So, she said, how is the solitude treating you? Most guys last about 2 weeks before they start radioing down, asking for a newspaper or a pizza."
"I like it," Elias said honestly. "It's heavy, but good heavy, like a weighted blanket."
"That's a good way to put it," Sarah nodded. "My grandfather used to say the mountain strips you down, takes away the noise. If you don't like who you are, you'll hate it up here. If you're okay with yourself, you'll never want to leave."
Elias thought of the journal in the basement. Guard the silence well. "I found something," Elias said, "in the attic." He told her about the oculus.
"The skylight? I thought that was a myth. The old-timers talk about the eye of the mountain, but nobody knew if it was real."
"It's real," Elias said. "I'm waiting for a clear night to open it up again."
"Tonight might be the night,"
Sarah said, gesturing to the window.
"Clouds are breaking. It's gonna be cold as hell, but clear."
She finished her coffee and stood up.
"I should head back. The trail is fresh, but I don't want to be riding in the dark."
"Thanks for checking on me," Elias said.
"Part of the job. But also, it's nice to see smoke coming from the chimney again. The lodge has been dark for too long. It likes to have a heartbeat."
She put her helmet back on. The engine roared to life, shattering the peace for a moment. She waved, and then she was gone, a yellow blur disappearing into the white woods. Elias stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded completely. He was alone again, but the loneliness felt different now. It wasn't isolation, it was privacy. He looked up at the sky. The clouds were tearing apart like cotton wool. Patches of deep, dark blue were showing through. He went back inside and began to prepare for the night. He moved the furniture in the attic, dragging the heavy drafting desk to the side. He brought up blankets, pillows, and a thermos of tea. He was going to open the oculus. The sun set at 4:30 p.m., dropping behind the peaks and turning the snow a deep, glowing indigo. By 6 p.m., it was night. Elias climbed the ladder to the attic. It was freezing up there. The heat from the downstairs didn't quite reach the peak of the roof, but he was dressed for it. He went to the iron crank. "Okay, Silas, let's see what you saw." He turned the crank. The gears groaned, the sound loud in the stillness. The wooden panel slid back. Elias looked up. He gasped. The glass was perfectly clear, and above it, infinity. Without the light pollution of the city, without the haze of the valley, the sky was a dense, crowded tapestry of diamonds. The Milky Way wasn't just a smudge, it was a distinct ribbon of light, a river of stars slashing across the black. He could see the colors, the blue-white of Sirius, the angry red of Betelgeuse. He lay down on the rug directly beneath the glass, pulling the blankets up to his chin. It felt like he was floating. The morning of the diamond dust. Elias woke to the sound of his own breath. In the unheated attic, the air was so cold that the moisture from his exhalations had formed tiny, fragile frost feathers on the wool blanket pulled up to his nose. He lay there for a moment, suspended in the gray light of dawn, remembering where he was. He wasn't in his bed. He was on the floor of the observatory, beneath the great glass eye of the lodge. He rolled over and looked up. The stars were gone, replaced by a sky the color of a robin's egg, pale and impossibly clean. The sun hadn't crested the peaks yet, but the alpenglow, that soft, rosy pink light that hits the high mountains first, was painting the tips of the granite spires above him. He sat up, his muscles stiff, but his spirit light. He turned the iron crank. Groan! Clank! The heavy wooden panel slid back into place, sealing the glass away, tucking the secret of the stars back into the roof. He descended the ladder, moving from the crisp, biting cold of the attic down into the lingering warmth of the second floor. The lodge felt different this morning. Before, it had been a shelter. Now it felt like a partner. He had shared a secret with it. Down in the kitchen, the routine began again, but with a new reverence. He ground the coffee beans, a rich, dark Colombian roast today, and the smell filled the room, earthy and sharp. He stood by the window while the water boiled, looking out at the lake. That's when he saw them. At first, he thought they were shadows, tricking his eyes against the white expanse of the frozen lake. But the shadows were moving. He grabbed his binoculars from the hook by the door and brought them to his eyes. Elk, a massive herd of them. They were moving in a single-file line across the ice, their breath steaming in the frigid air. There must have been 50 of them. The bulls were at the edges, their antlers massive and dark, looking like velvet-covered trees. The cows and calves were in the center, protected. They moved in total silence. Their hooves, designed for the high country, didn't slip on the ice. They walked with a regal, plodding dignity. Elias lowered the binoculars. He didn't want to watch them through glass. He wanted to see them with his own eyes. He felt a sudden urge to be closer, to share the morning with them. He pulled on his boots and his parka, not bothering to zip it all the way up, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold was sharp, sitting at about 5 degrees below zero. The air was filled with diamond dust, tiny ice crystals suspended in the air that sparkled as they drifted, looking like floating glitter. Elias stood perfectly still. The herd was about 200 yards away. Suddenly, the lead bull stopped. He was a magnificent creature, his coat a thick, shaggy brown, his neck swollen with muscle. He turned his head and looked directly at the lodge, directly at Elias. Time seemed to stretch. The bull didn't spook. He didn't run. He simply acknowledged Elias's presence. You are there. We are here. This is the truce of winter. Then, with a snort that sent a jet of white steam into the air, the bull turned back to the path and continued the march. The herd followed, a river of brown fur flowing against the white ice, disappearing slowly into the tree line on the far shore. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Safe travels, he whispered. The secret of the hearth. The encounter with the elk stayed with him all morning. It reinforced the feeling that he was living in a world that operated on a different frequency. By mid-afternoon, the sun was high and bright, streaming through the south-facing windows of the great room. He found himself staring at the fireplace. The fire was crackling happily, consuming a log of seasoned oak. He remembered the entry in Silas's journal, the one he had read during the storm. I hid a coin in the mortar behind the center stone, a silver dollar for luck. Elias put down his book. He walked over to the massive stone hearth. The heat was intense, pushing him back, but he shielded his face with his hand and leaned in. The center stone was a large, rounded river rock, gray with flecks of mica that sparkled in the firelight. It was set deeply into the masonry. Elias looked at the mortar surrounding it. It was rough, gray cement, darkened by a century of soot. But on the right side of the stone, there was a small imperfection, a tiny lip of mortar that looked slightly different, slightly smoother. He went to the kitchen and grabbed a small paring knife. He returned to the fire. He carefully scraped at the soot. The black dust fell away, revealing a lighter gray patch. It looked like a plug. His heart beat a little faster. It was a treasure hunt in his own living room. He used the point of the knife to gently work around the edge of the plug. It was crumbly, old lime mortar. He picked at it carefully, not to damage the stone. Chuk! A small chunk of mortar fell onto the hearth rug. Behind it was a hollow space. He reached in with his pinky finger. He felt something cold and smooth. He hooked it and pulled. It slid out into his palm. It was heavy. He wiped the soot off on his jeans. A silver dollar. He held it up to the firelight. It was a peace dollar, dated 1922. The silver was tarnished, but the relief was sharp. The eagle on the back clutched an olive branch, looking toward the dawn. Peace, Elias thought. Silas hid peace in the heart of the house. He didn't pocket the coin. It didn't belong to him. It belonged to the lodge. He placed it on the mantelpiece, right next to the briar pipe and the wooden bird he had found in the cabin. It was a growing collection of totems, the anchors that held the history of timberline together. The ice below. A week passed. The weather settled into a pattern of clear, bitter cold nights and sunny, blindingly bright days. This was the deep winter, the time when the snowpack hardens and the world feels permanent, as if summer is just a myth. Elias decided it was time to venture onto the lake, not to cross it, but to see what lived beneath it. He found the ice auger in the shed, a long corkscrew-like tool with a handle on top, and he also found a simple fishing rod and a box of tackle. He walked out onto the ice. It was a strange sensation walking on water. He knew the ice was at least 2 feet thick enough to drive a tank on, but there was still a primal thrill of danger. Every now and then the lake would sing. The ice would shift or crack deep below the surface, sending a booming, sonar-like twang.
He set the hook with a sharp upward jerk. The rod bent. It wasn't a monster, but it was fighting. He reeled in, the line cutting circles in the water. A flash of silver appeared in the hole. Elias lifted the fish out. It was a rainbow trout, about 12 inches long. Its scales were iridescent, flashing pink and green in the sunlight. It flapped against the ice, a burst of frantic life in a frozen world. Elias looked at it. It was beautiful. A survivor. He carefully unhooked it. He held it for a moment, feeling the cold slime of its skin, admiring its perfection. "Not today," he said. He lowered the fish back into the hole. It hovered for a second, stunned, and then flick. It was gone, diving back into the dark depths. Elias smiled. He didn't need the food. The pantry was full. He just needed the connection. He packed up his gear. He left the hole open. It would freeze over by nightfall, leaving only a scar on the surface to show he had been there. The workbench and the clock. The days began to blur. January turned into February. The snow deepened, burying the fence posts completely. Elias spent his evenings in the basement workshop. He had found a project. Among the clutter on the shelves, he had found an old cuckoo clock. It was a Black Forest style, carved with intricate leaves and birds, but it was in sorry shape. The chains were tangled, the bellows were torn, and the bird was missing its beak. It was the perfect task for a man who needed to keep his hands busy. He moved the clock to Silas's workbench. He set up a bright lamp. He worked slowly. There was no deadline. If it took him all winter, that was fine. He disassembled the movement, laying the brass gears out on a velvet cloth. He cleaned each tooth with a toothbrush dipped in oil. He patched the tiny leather bellows with scraps of fabric. He carved a new beak for the wooden bird from a splinter of pine. The work was soothing. It was a return to his old life in Seattle, but without the pressure of customers. He wasn't fixing it for money. He was fixing it because broken things deserved to be whole again. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, the third of the season, Elias finally reassembled the mechanism. He hung the clock on a pillar in the basement. He attached the heavy pine cone weights to the chains. He gave the pendulum a nudge. Tick, Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was strong, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. Elias waited. He watched the minute hand creep toward the 12. Click. Whir. The little door at the top of the clock snapped open. The bird popped out, bright and new with its pine beak. Cuckoo! 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 The sound echoed in the large basement. It was a cheerful, silly sound, completely at odds with the solemnity of the mountain. Elias laughed. He laughed loud and long, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. He left the clock running. Now when he went down to check the boiler or fetch supplies, he had a companion, a little mechanical bird that marked the passing of the winter, hour by hour. The night of the Northern Lights. It was mid-February when the sky decided to put on a show that rivaled the Oculus. Elias was reading in the library at around 11 p.m. He had been feeling restless all evening, a strange energy in his limbs that he couldn't walk off. He happened to glance out the north-facing window. The sky wasn't black. It was green. He dropped his book. He ran to the mudroom, threw on his coat and boots, and scrambled out the door. He didn't stop at the porch. He ran out into the middle of the clearing, away from the house lights, trudging through the knee-deep snow. He looked up. The aurora borealis. It was a curtain of shimmering emerald light hanging from the stars. It rippled and folded like silk in a breeze. It wasn't static. It was dancing. Great ribbons of light twisted and turned, fading to violet at the edges.
The promise of the thaw. March arrived with a change in the wind. It was still cold, freezing at night, but the sun had a new weight to it. It felt warmer on the face. The icicles hanging from the roof, which had grown to be 6 feet long, began to drip. Drip, drip, drip. It was the music of spring, faint but persistent. Elias went out one morning to find the snow on the roof sliding. A massive sheet of white curled over the eaves, hanging like a wave about to break. He took a long pole and gently poked it. Whoosh! Tons of snow cascaded down, thundering onto the ground below, clearing the roof tiles. The sound was like an avalanche. Underneath, the green copper roof glinted in the sun, seeing the light for the first time in 4 months. The thaw had begun. It wouldn't be quick. It would take weeks for the snow to melt. The road would remain impassable for a month, but the grip of the deep winter was loosening. Elias felt a strange pang of melancholy. He had fallen in love with the isolation. He liked the wall of white that separated him from the world. As the snow melted, the road would reappear. The gate would open. The world would come back. But not yet. He still had time. He went to the woodpile. He picked out a piece of birch wood. He sat on the porch, in the sun, and took out his pocket knife. He began to whittle. He didn't know what he was making yet. Maybe a bear, maybe a tree. He just let the knife follow the grain of the wood. The sun warmed his shoulders. The drip of the melting ice kept time. The chickadees, sensing the change in season, were singing their two-note song from the pines. Cheeseburger, cheeseburger. Elias breathed in the smell of wet pine and mud, the scent of the earth waking up. He was ready for spring, but he would savor every last second of the winter watch.